An old mechanic was humiliated by his appearance, but when he did what no one else could with the Ferrari, those who mocked his dirty hands fell silent. Welcome to Tales of Conquest. Before we begin, like, subscribe, and tell us which country you're listening from, because this story will stay in your heart forever. In a dusty corner of Puebla, between narrow streets where the sun barely peeked through tin roofs, there was a small mechanic's shop. The rusty sign hanging over the door read, Taller San Miguel, but no one had read it for years. No one needed it. Right next door stood the imposing Torque Master building, the new multi-brand workshop that promised cutting-edge technology, personalized service, and computerized diagnostics. That's where everyone took their cars. Here, instead, only the stragglers remained, those without resources or the corn-eared daredevils. Don Julian, the only mechanic still working at Taller San Miguel, always arrived at 6 o'clock sharp. No one knew exactly how old he was, but his white hair, slightly hunched back, and hands marked by old grease and silent scars, spoke for him. He wore the same gray overalls every day, stitched in the same places for as long as anyone could remember. Some young people in the neighborhood called him the carburetor ghost, not out of fear, but because he worked almost unnoticed. He opened, closed, hammered, welded, but never spoke more than necessary. One Monday morning, the usual routine was broken. A cherry-red Ferrari 458 Italia appeared hitched to a tow truck in front of Torque Master. The engine had mysteriously failed, and not even the center's technicians had managed to identify the root of the problem. The workshop manager, the young and arrogant Ivan Espinoza, the owner's son, came out to assess the situation. Tight suit, catalog smile, and a tablet in hand. "That model again?" he scoffed. "There's no way that hydraulic system is failing like that. We already changed the sensors." "Perhaps we should consult the headquarters, sir," one of the technicians suggested, hesitantly. Ivan frowned and shook his head. "That would take weeks. No, we're going to solve it here, or we'll look incompetent to the client. Not an option." A few minutes later, an internal argument erupted. No one wanted to take responsibility for something that had already passed through 2 different hands and was still failing. Meanwhile, the impatient tow truck continued to block the street. It was then that something unexpected happened. From the opposite sidewalk, Don Julian, with a rusty screwdriver in his pocket and a rag hanging from his belt, approached silently. He looked at the Ferrari with a serene expression, without surprise or evident interest. Then he slightly raised an eyebrow and murmured, "That sound isn't hydraulic. It's the secondary valve of the pressure system. It's unbalanced inside." "No, you'll see it on the computer." Everyone turned to him. Ivan let out a mocking laugh. "And who are you?" "The Holy Spirit of the old workshop." Don Julian didn't respond. He just walked to the back of the car and listened carefully to the faint click of the system as it was turned on. Then he looked at Ivan again, calmly. "If you give me 20 minutes, I can fix it." The technicians looked at each other, between laughter and discomfort. "Please," one of the supervisors interrupted. "We don't want any damage. This car costs more than your entire workshop." But the owner of the Ferrari, a businessman named Hector, who until then had remained silent on the phone, approached with a frown. "He says he can fix it in 20 minutes. Don Julian nodded calmly. "Try him," Hector said, against all expectations. "No one else has been able to." Ivan protested immediately, but Hector stopped him with a firm gesture. "If he damages it, I'll pay. But if he fixes it, will you explain why you couldn't?" Ivan swallowed hard. No one had spoken to him like that in years. Don Julian crouched beside the engine, slowly opened the rear cover, extracted 3 basic tools he carried in an old leather bag, and began to work. Each movement was precise. He didn't use gloves, flashlight, or sensors, just his hands, his ear, and a small pair of pliers. The technicians approached, first out of curiosity, then out of bewilderment. One of them murmured, "He can't be doing what I think he is." Don Julian didn't look up. He just said one phrase. "It's not about seeing. It's about listening to what the engine wants to say." 15 minutes later, he closed the cover with a soft click. "Try it now," he said to the businessman. Hector got into the vehicle, turned the key, and the sound was different, clean, harmonious, the exact factory roar. Everyone fell silent. Only the engine and the collective astonishment could be heard. Ivan couldn't articulate a word. Don Julian had already started walking back to his workshop when one of the young men exclaimed, "Who is that old man?" But no one had the answer. The news spread like hot oil on concrete. In less than an hour, the rumor about the old man who fixed a Ferrari with his hands had already reached the downtown cafes, mechanic chats, and engineering student groups. It was a story that defied modern logic. A man without a brand uniform, without a scanner or computer. Yet he had achieved in minutes what 2 certified engineers couldn't in days. As evening fell, 3 torque master technicians discreetly crossed the street and knocked on the door of taller San Miguel. Don Julian was quietly cleaning a carburetor cover with a wire brush and a little diesel. The smell of old grease and patience filled the air. "Excuse me, Don," the youngest said. "Can we see how you made that adjustment?" "Don Julian," he replied immediately. He looked up, observed them calmly, and then pointed to a box of old tools on the bench. "Take whatever you want to see, but if you don't listen, you won't understand." The young men entered respectfully, as if crossing the threshold of a church. They touched the tools carefully, not knowing exactly what they were looking for, but aware that there was something different there, something that wasn't taught in manuals. The next morning, Ivan Espinosa arrived at Torquemaster with a frown and wounded pride. The Ferrari owner had sent a brief message. "Thanks for the attempt. From now on, I'll take my cars to the workshop across the street." The humiliation wasn't just real, it was signed by the most demanding client of the month. Ivan locked himself in his glass office, forbidding interruptions. But throughout the day, the workshop door opened again and again with the same question. "Does the gentleman who fixes Ferraris with his hands work here?" "No, he's across the street." At Taller San Miguel, Don Julian didn't change his pace. He didn't hang signs, didn't raise prices, didn't post on social media. He just kept doing what he always did, fixing. But now, something had changed. Outside, a discreet line of cars began to form, from a modest Chevy to a latest generation BMW. Everyone wanted the same thing. "Have the gentleman listen to it." On Wednesday afternoon, an official car from the mayor's office stopped in front of the workshop. A man in a beige suit, with a diplomatic demeanor and a slow gait, got out. He approached, extended his hand, and said formally, "Mr. Julian, we want to invite you to a recognition ceremony." The mayor was impressed. "We'd like to present you with a medal for your career." Don Julian barely raised his eyebrows. He wiped his hands with a gray rag and replied without raising his voice, "I didn't work my whole life for applause." "But it would be fair," the official insisted. "Then do justice, not propaganda." And he returned to his engine as if nothing had happened. The uncomfortable official just nodded and left. Across the street, Ivan had seen everything from his window. What was once mockery was now annoyance, and what was annoyance soon turned into obsession. He called one of his trusted technicians and told him in a low voice, "I want you to find out everything about that old man." On Thursday morning, Ivan Espinosa didn't greet anyone upon arriving at the workshop. His jaw was clenched, his eyes had dark circles, and he held a folder in his hand. He had spent much of the night navigating labor databases, advanced mechanics forums, and old records. He hadn't found anything concrete, but that only obsessed him more. At 11:17, his trusted technician Luis knocked on his office door and entered with a manila envelope under his arm. "This is all I could get," he said, placing it on the desk. "There's not much, but there's something." Ivan opened the folder impatiently. Inside were scanned clippings, personnel lists from defunct workshops, handwritten entry forms. A pattern repeated. The name, Julian Ortega. He appeared, but always as an auxiliary, assistant, basic operator. He never appeared as a department head, coordinator, much less an engineer. But one sheet caught Ivan's attention. It was a blurry copy of a confidential file, with a red stamp in the corner that read, "Restricted Access, Minerva Project, Year 1997. It contained no technical data, but in the margins there were handwritten annotations. Unusual precision. Impossible adjustments without digital equipment. Rejected official contract. Voluntary departure." Ivan frowned. "What the hell is this?" Luis shrugged. "An old supervisor told me that Minerva was an experimental government project. No one really knows what was done there, but those who participated signed non-disclosure agreements." "And are you sure it's him?" "I can't prove it, but look at this." Luis pulled out a photograph printed on old paper. In it, a large industrial warehouse could be seen, with a metal structure in the process of assembly. To the left, a group of men in helmets and work clothes. One of them, almost in the shadows, had his face partially visible. It was him, Don Julian, 25 years younger, but with the same serene expression, the same calm posture. His hands crossed behind his back like someone who has seen it all. Ivan didn't say a word. He closed the folder, stared out the window for a few seconds, and then stood up. "Am I going to talk to him?" "Now?" Luis asked, surprised. "Yes, before someone else does. Before he becomes a legend that can no longer be talked about, only remembered." That afternoon, Don Julian was finishing adjusting the carburetor of an old truck when Ivan crossed the street without warning. He held the folder in his hand, and his brow was furrowed. "I need to talk to you," he said directly, without greeting. Don Julian didn't flinch. He calmly wiped his hands and gestured for him to speak. "I've seen your file, or what little there is, and I also saw this photo." He opened the folder and showed it to him. And you worked on a restricted project. You have skills no one here understands. Who is Don Julian, really?" The old mechanic looked at him in silence. There was no annoyance in his eyes, but a kind of ancient weariness. "Do you really want to know?" he asked. "Yes," Ivan replied firmly. Don Julian walked to a small table at the back of the workshop. He sat down slowly and offered the young engineer a chair. "Then listen, but don't interrupt me, because I don't plan to repeat it." Ivan nodded and sat down in front, without blinking. And Don Julian began to speak. "In another time, I had names, titles, credentials. I was called to work on projects where the blueprints arrived in sealed envelopes and mistakes were not allowed. I knew more machines than people. I learned to feel metals, to read the sounds of an engine as if they were musical notes. But the higher I climbed, the less they listened. They wanted results, not truth. Precision, not soul. Ivan listened, increasingly disconcerted. One day I resigned. I moved away. I changed cities, names, everything. I opened this workshop not to hide, but to remember why I started building. Because I had forgotten, and when you forget why you do what you do, then you lose your soul in the process. Ivan swallowed. His words had gone deeper than he expected. And why did you never want to be recognized? He finally asked. Don Julian smiled faintly. Because what is valuable doesn't need to be signed. As he left the workshop, Ivan didn't know if he was furious, admired, confused, or all at once. He only knew one thing. He was facing someone he couldn't control, and that, for someone like him, was dangerous. The following days passed with an invisible tension that could be breathed in the air. At Torquemaster, Ivan was restless, walking with his cell phone in hand, giving orders without clear direction. Although no one said it aloud, everyone knew that Don Julian's name was beginning to weigh more than his own. Meanwhile, at Taller San Miguel, the rhythm remained intact. Don Julian didn't talk about the Ferrari, nor the file, nor the past. He just focused on his work. But the clients increased, and not only out of curiosity. Most came by direct recommendation from someone who said the same thing over and over. I don't know how he does it, but when he fixes it, it never fails again. One afternoon, something unexpected happened. A luxury armored SUV with out-of-state plates parked in front of the workshop. From the back seat emerged a woman of 1900, dressed in a dark suit, black glasses, and with a firm gait. She carried a thin folder and a watch that seemed to be worth more than the entire workshop combined. Don Julian looked at her calmly, without getting up from the car he was working on. "Are you Julian Ortega?" she asked directly. "Depends. Who's asking?" "I work for a private foundation. We manage a collection of historic cars. One of our most valuable vehicles, a 1952 Jaguar XK120, has presented a fault that no one has been able to solve. A contact told us about you." Don Julian took off his gloves, wiped his hands, and looked at her serenely. "And what exactly do you expect?" "We expect you to repair it, and to do it quickly." The answer was dry, unadorned. "Then find someone else." The woman frowned. "We'll pay you whatever you ask." "It's not about that," he said, turning towards the engine. "It's open." "Then what is it about?" "Time. I don't work with watches over my head." The woman observed him for a few seconds, as if trying to decipher him. Then she took out a thin card, left it on the tool table, and left without another word. That night, the Jaguar XK120 was transported to the workshop on a special tow truck, escorted by a security car. The driver left the keys on the workbench and left without a word. The car was a gem, elegant, impeccable, and completely dead. Don Julian observed it for a long time, without touching it. He didn't start the engine, didn't check fuses, didn't connect scanners. He just looked at it, as one looks at an old friend who has kept a secret too long. The next morning, Adrian, a young apprentice who had started helping in the workshop, was sweeping the entrance when he saw him there, alone, in front of the Jaguar. He approached cautiously. "Don Julian, can I look?" "You can look, yes, but don't ask questions yet." Adrian obeyed. For more than 3 hours, Julian dismantled parts with an almost surgical gentleness. He didn't make notes, didn't consult diagrams. His eyes, his ears, and his hands seemed to have a language of their own. Every movement was precise, every gesture measured. After midday, Adrian could no longer resist. "And do you already know what's wrong with it?" "Yes," Julian replied. "The problem isn't the engine, it's the soul." "Excuse me?" "This car was made to run free, but they locked it in a display case. It's rusted inside, even if it shines on the outside. They forced it to be static, and that's why it shut down." Adrian, at 8 in the morning the following Monday, Don Julian opened the gate of Taller San Miguel, as always, unhurriedly, with a rusty key that turned smoothly, as if the metal also obeyed him. On the workbench, he found something unexpected, a black box with the Torque Master logo, wrapped with a silver ribbon. No one had left it the night before. Adrian, the young apprentice, looked at it with suspicion. "Should we open it?" "Things that are not asked for bring noise," Don Julian said, but he still untied the ribbon. Inside, a leather folder with the embossed logo, and inside the folder, a contract. They offered a position as technical director at Torque Master, private office, company vehicle, fixed salary, plus performance bonuses, his own team at his disposal, and, as a final note, freedom to intervene in any project. Adrian read over his shoulder, wide-eyed. "Are you going to accept it?" Don Julian closed the folder without answering. "Do you know how many people dream of an opportunity like that?" the young man insisted. "Yes, and I also know how many wake up regretting it," he replied as he walked to the back of the workshop. That same afternoon, Ivan Espinoza appeared in person. He wore his best gray suit, his hair slicked back, a tense smile that couldn't hide his discomfort. "Don Julian," he greeted professionally. "I'm glad to see you. I hope you've considered our proposal." The old mechanic didn't interrupt what he was doing. He was adjusting the Jaguar's carburetor with a fine screwdriver. Only after a few seconds did he speak. "I read it. I didn't understand it." "What part wasn't clear?" "The part where it says you'll respect me." "That's not written, Ivan." He smiled coldly. "Look, I didn't come to argue. I came to give you a real opportunity. You work with your hands. I respect that. But there, can you leave a legacy? Can you teach, direct, supervise, and stop getting your hands dirty?" "Exactly. You're too old to be under cars." Don Julian placed the screwdriver on the table with a faint clack. "I didn't come into the world to command. I came to fix what others don't know how to listen to." Ivan lost his smile. He took a step forward. "Look, old man, what you do is fine for the romantics in the neighborhood. But we're talking about growing, about real recognition, about ceasing to be an urban legend and becoming an authority. Or do you prefer to die here among old scrap metal and grease?" Don Julian didn't get upset. "I prefer that to dying in an office, surrounded by diplomas, and without knowing how to listen to a wounded engine." Ivan clenched his teeth. Adrian, who was nearby, held his breath. "Then don't say we didn't offer it," Ivan said, turning around. When he reached the door, Don Julian spoke one last time. "The only authority I respect is the one earned. With time. Not with suits or logos." That night, the air was denser at Torque Master. Ivan paced his office, staring at the framed team photograph on the wall. Everyone in clean uniforms, smiling, in front of a Maserati. But all he heard in his head was the phrase, "The part where it says you'll respect me." That wasn't written. The next day, the Jaguar XK120 roared again. It was a deep, pure, profound sound, as if the car had woken from a long slumber. Adrian was there, the owner of the foundation too. But no one spoke. Everyone knew that roar didn't just come from the engine. It was the echo of a warning. The city had begun to listen to a man who didn't need to speak loudly to be heard. Adrian was the first to upload it. He didn't plan it. He didn't think about it. He just took out his phone, still trembling with emotion from witnessing the rebirth of the Jaguar XK120, and recorded the exact moment the engine roared like a freed beast. He uploaded the video to his account with a simple phrase. An engineer didn't fix it. An old man with dirty hands and a clean soul brought it back. Don Julian, thank you for teaching me to listen. In less than an hour, the video already had 12,000 views. By night, it had passed 100,000. And at dawn, news portals, automotive accounts, and specialized blogs began to share it. No one understood how that engine had recovered its essence without software, without digital intervention, without a single new cable, just old tools, and a man who no longer wanted to be recognized. Adrian arrived early at the workshop the next day. Upon opening the gate, he found Don Julian, as always, focused, silent, his gaze fixed on a disassembled carburetor. "Do you know how many views the video has now?" the agitated young man asked. "No, almost 500,000. They're calling him the impossible mechanic." Don Julian didn't look up. He just said, "And all that without the car having learned to speak." Adrian smiled, but inside, he felt a mix of excitement and guilt. He didn't want to expose him, but at the same time, the world had to know. Meanwhile, at Torquemaster, Ivan read the headline of a digital magazine on his tablet. "The old man who revives cars as if they breathe. Who is Julian Ortega, the mechanic who defies modern logic?" They had used an image from Adrian's video, and the worst part, among the comments, engineers, car designers, and even certified mechanics began to refer to Don Julian as the last master craftsman. Ivan couldn't bear it. "You want legends?" he said to himself. "I'll show you that even legends rust." That afternoon, as the sun set over the tin roofs, and the workshop remained full of new customers, a black van stopped in front of the gate. Two men got out, one in a suit and one with a camera in hand. "Don Julian Ortega?" the man in the suit asked. "We're from Engines with History, a documentary series about forgotten figures in automotive history. We want to tell your story to the world. A special with filming, interviews, recreations." Don Julian paused for a moment. His eyes showed no annoyance, but no enthusiasm either. Ivan was not a patient man. For years, he had carefully built his image. The young, modern, efficient engineer with degrees from recognized universities and contacts with the best brands. All his prestige was built on mission and control, projection and results. But now, a man with stained hands and minimal words was stealing the spotlight, without seeking it, without wanting it. And that made it even worse. On Thursday morning, news began to circulate through mechanics forums and professional groups. The supposed master of Taller San Miguel was never an engineer. He has no certifications. His record is a mystery. Who are you glorifying? The publication was signed by an anonymous account, but it was obvious who was behind it. Adrian read it on his cell phone, with a knot in his stomach. He ran to the workshop. "Don Julian, they're saying things about you, that you don't have papers, that you're not professional, that you're dangerous." The old man was under an old car, adjusting the transmission shaft. "And is that new?" "But it's everywhere. They're trying to dirty your name." Don Julian slowly emerged, wiped his hands, and looked at him intently. "If someone needs a piece of paper to believe what they see with their own eyes, then I have nothing to teach them." Adrian pressed his lips together. "But it's not fair." Justice doesn't live on the internet. It lives in what one does, when no one is looking. Despite Don Julian's words, the attack had an effect. Some clients canceled their appointments. A couple of suppliers stopped delivering spare parts. Even some neighbors crossed the street more quickly. Doubt, like rust, spreads quickly when no one cleans it in time. But there were those who didn't fall for it. One afternoon, an elderly man entered the workshop with a worn notebook under his arm. He introduced himself as Esteban Morales, a former professor of mechanical engineering. "Are you Don Julian Ortega?" "Depends on who's asking." "A grateful one," the man said, showing him the notebook. 28 years ago, I saw a structure you repaired in Querétaro. It was impossible to lift without blueprints. No one understood how you did it. I never forgot your name." Don Julian silently skimmed the notebook. He recognized a handmade sketch. It was his. He had forgotten that someone had been observing. Esteban looked him in the eyes. "Can I stay and watch you work?" Don Julian nodded. And so, one by one, they began to arrive. Old colleagues, apprentices from other states, mechanics who had once crossed paths with him without knowing it. They didn't need proof. They had heard how a machine breathes when it feels understood. At Torquemaster, Ivan pounded the table in anger. "Why didn't it work? We gave them data. We showed what he doesn't have." Luis, his trusted technician, looked at him nervously. "Maybe. It's not about what he doesn't have, boss. It's about what he transmits. He doesn't transmit anything. He just fixes. He doesn't give talks, doesn't record courses, doesn't appear on television. And still, everyone talks about him." Ivan slumped. He took a deep breath and said something he never thought he'd say. "Then, we'll have to make him fall by his own shadow." That same night, an anonymous person filed a formal complaint with the city council. Taller San Miguel operates with an uncertified technician, without updated permits or digital registration, requires immediate inspection. The signature was fake, but the blow would be real. On Monday morning, the sun was just beginning to peek over the low roofs of the neighborhood when a white van with the city council's emblem parked in front of Taller San Miguel. Adrian was sweeping the entrance when he saw it stop. A shiver ran down his spine. "Don Julian, they're from the municipality," he said softly. The old man looked up from the open engine of a classic car. He calmly wiped his hands and nodded. "Sooner or later, Ivan would come," he replied, without surprise. Two inspectors got out of the vehicle with folders in hand, gray vests and tense faces, the kind that arrive with a decision already made. The older one stepped forward with an institutional tone. "Julian Ortega." "That's me," he replied. "We received an anonymous complaint. The legality of your operation is being questioned. We have authorization to conduct a complete inspection." Don Julian didn't argue. He walked to the workshop gate and opened it serenely. "Come in. I have nothing to hide, nor to prove." The officials began their review. Electrical installations, fire extinguishers, ventilation, hanging permits, some old but visible, and a folder of handwritten records. Everything was modest, but in order. One of the inspectors stopped in front of a metal box next to the wall. "What does this contain?" "Old spare parts. Some are no longer manufactured, but they work better than new ones." The man opened it, inspected it with gloves, and took notes. "Do you have an updated professional registration?" "No," Julian replied honestly. "Any official technical degree?" "Never. I needed it to listen to an engine," he said in a firm but calm voice. The inspector wrote something else and looked at him expressionlessly. "We'll have to summon you for a technical evaluation. It's mandatory procedure in these cases." All right, let me know when. That afternoon, the inspection report arrived discreetly in an inbox at Torque Master. Ivan read it with a barely contained smile. Possible preventive closure of Taller San Miguel until evaluation is completed. That's how a myth deflates, he murmured, satisfied. Luis, his trusted technician, said nothing. But as he lowered his gaze to the floor, something inside him began to stir. He had seen with his own eyes what Julian did. He had felt something he couldn't put into words. At 7 o'clock, Adrian closed the workshop gate without speaking. Don Julian was collecting his tools with his usual routine, as if nothing had happened. "Aren't you angry?" the young man finally asked. "Angry about what? They want to close us for something we didn't do?" Don Julian paused. He looked at him serenely and replied, "Engines don't stop because of outside noise, Adrian. Only when the fire inside goes out. But this isn't fair. Justice walks slow." On Tuesday, from very early morning, something different was in the air in the neighborhood. It wasn't the usual smell of burnt oil or the rhythm of running engines. It was a new murmur. Neighbors who used to just pass by now stopped in front of Taller San Miguel. Some peeked in. Others left messages on folded papers under the door, and others simply knocked on the gate and remained silent for a few seconds, as if waiting to hear something from the other side. Don Julian, true to his custom, opened punctually. "Today there's a risk they'll shut us down," Adrian told him as they took out the tools. "Then let them find us working," the old man replied, as if talking about the weather. What they didn't know was that Adrian's video had not only reached millions of views, it had also touched a chord. Hundreds of former technical school students, retired mechanics, engineers with workshop souls, and young apprentices began to share their own stories under the hashtag #AyoTubeUnJulian. Social media filled with anecdotes. "My grandfather taught me to adjust without looking. My uncle knew how to read an engine by the smell of the oil. My neighborhood teacher taught me more than all of university." The name of Don Julian Ortega was no longer just that of an old mechanic. He was a symbol, a mirror, an echo of all those who had once been great without seeking it. That same day, at 11:00, 3 inspectors returned to the workshop. But this time they weren't alone. Outside, more than 40 people, neighbors, clients, students, journalists, were gathered on the sidewalk, with cell phones in hand and improvised banners. "No to the closure of Taller San Miguel. Don Julian doesn't need papers. He has history. Respect those who built with their hands." The inspectors tried to speak calmly. Don Julian greeted them with a minimal smile. "You know where the tools are. Check whatever you need." But before they could advance, a journalist with a microphone in hand interrupted. "Did you know that this workshop has more accumulated working hours than any in the industrial zone? Did you know that the community defends him because he has even repaired official cars without charging when the client couldn't pay?" The officials looked at each other uncomfortably. They weren't prepared for cameras, much less for a crowd that didn't insult them, but also didn't leave. "We're just following orders," one said, "and we're following memory," replied an elderly woman with tears in her eyes. "That man fixed my husband's car when even I didn't believe it could work again, and he didn't charge us a single cent. He just said, 'Tell him to go home carefully.'" A reverent silence covered the block. In the afternoon, the news had already crossed borders. International media replicated headlines such as "The mechanic the system wanted to silence" and "The town turned into a living legend." On the other side of the city, Ivan watched on his screen as his plan crumbled, He slammed his laptop shut. He took a deep breath. He looked at his reflection in his office glass. For the first time, he didn't see himself as a leader. He saw himself as what he was, a man who had everything, except the respect of those who mattered most. That night, as he closed the workshop, Adrian handed Don Julian a printed sheet. It was a letter signed by more than 500 technicians, students, and professionals from all over Latin America, supporting the last master of engines with a soul. "This is yours," Adrian told him. Don Julian read it in silence. He said nothing. He just caressed the paper with his fingers, and he smiled, for the first time in many years. Wednesday dawned with a strange calm. The line of cars in front of Taller San Miguel continued to grow. It was no longer just neighbors or curious onlookers. Now there were cars with plates from other states, motorcyclists who had traveled all night, even a couple of engineering students camping in front of the facade with notebooks in hand and eager eyes. They weren't there for a repair. They came to watch, to listen, to be close. Adrian could barely keep up. Between greetings, messages of support, technical inquiries, press calls, and unexpected visits, the workshop seemed more like a school than a business. And in the midst of it all, as always, Don Julian continued to work, in the same worn overalls, with the same rag hanging from his belt, with the same peace that defied the noise of the world. That day, at precisely 10 o'clock, an official delegation arrived. This time, it wasn't inspectors. It was the director of the Municipal Secretary of Commerce himself, accompanied by 2 advisors and a communication team. Adrian tensed as he saw them. "Don Julian, I think they really want to shut you down now." But the old man barely looked up. "They've come with papers before. We'll see if today they come with ears." The officials got out of the van, greeted the public with measured gestures, and asked to speak to Julian alone. They invited him to sit under an improvised awning in front of the workshop. He was surrounded by cameras, microphones, and a group of journalists filming from a distance, respectfully but hungry for a story. The director spoke first. "Mr. Ortega, we know what has happened. We also know there are formal irregularities, but we haven't found serious faults. The problem is that your workshop, legally, doesn't meet the current requirements to continue operating." Adrian took a step forward, annoyed. "Then update the requirements. The problem isn't him, it's the system." But Julian stopped him with a gentle gesture. "Let me answer." He turned to the official, looked at him without resentment, and spoke firmly. "If you want to close these doors, do it. You won't see me fight. But listen to this. In this place, more than 100 young people learned to work who are now in companies, factories, and even outside the country. Here, I repaired ambulances when no one else could. Here, I received people who came crying because they didn't even have money to go home. And I never asked for a prize. I only asked them to watch their path. The silence was total. Some recorded, others cried. So if you want to close this workshop, do it. But know that you are not closing a business. You are silencing a story that does not belong to you." The director swallowed. He turned to his team. Then, back to Julian. "We are not going to close it." A contained exclamation swept through the street. "But we are going to do something," he continued. "We are going to register this workshop as a community center for traditional mechanical training. You will be the reference. You don't need papers. Your history is your certificate." Adrian let out the breath he had been holding for hours. Don Julian said nothing immediately. He just looked at the sky for an instant and replied, "I don't need to be a symbol, but if that helps them not to forget, then I accept." From that day on, Taller San Miguel was transformed. The transformation of Taller San Miguel was as natural as it was silent. There was no official ceremony, no ribbon to cut, no long speeches. Just a discreet sign nailed to the entrance that read, Community Center for Traditional Mechanical Training, Don Julian Ortega, underneath. A phrase engraved in metal that he had not authorized, but that no one dared to remove. The knowledge that is not boasted is the one that lasts the longest. From that day on, every week, new groups arrived. High school students, apprentices frustrated with theoretical methods, young people without resources, but also curious engineers, plant managers, and even university professors. All with the same goal: to observe, to listen, to understand. Don Julian did not change his way of teaching. He did not use blackboards. He did not explain formulas. He did not sit down to lecture. He just worked. And whoever knew how to look, learned. Adrian became more than an assistant. He now organized visits, guided groups, explained what he could, and translated in his own words what he saw Don Julian do with his hands. One afternoon, while disassembling the engine of a classic Citroën, Julian told him, "Do you know what the hardest part about teaching is?" "What?" "Waiting for the other person to truly listen." Adrian nodded, without replying. He understood now. At the end of the month, an international documentary channel sent a letter requesting to film a special about Don Julian. He didn't respond. He just passed the letter under the counter, unopened. But Adrian, with more confidence than before, dared to ask, "Why do you never want to be filmed?" "Because whoever needs to see me is already here. But this could last forever. Your story could inspire thousands more." "And isn't it already doing that?" the old man replied, pointing to the line of children sitting on the floor, waiting their turn to watch how a carburetor was adjusted. "Yes, but I don't need to be on a screen for them to remember my voice. As long as someone says, 'Don Julian used to do it like that,' we've already won." Meanwhile, at Torque Master, Ivan's downfall was slow, but inevitable. Clientele no longer trusted him as before. Staff were demotivated, and Luis himself, his trusted technician, had requested a formal meeting. "I want to resign," he told him bluntly. Ivan frowned. "Are you going with him?" "No, it no longer serves me to stay where the uniform is valued more than capability." Ivan didn't answer. Luis left his ID on the table and left. One Saturday, without warning, Ivan's father appeared at the workshop. An older man with a firm demeanor and a slow walk, who had been an engineer all his life. He stood in front of the gate, looked at it, and then said, "Is Don Julian here?" "Who? Are you looking for him?" Adrian asked, curious. A colleague who once learned something from him without realizing it. Don Julian came out. They looked at each other in silence and then shook hands. They didn't talk about the past. They didn't need to. They just shared an afternoon of work, as if time hadn't passed, as if everything important could be said with a look. That same day, as evening fell, Adrian found Julian sitting outside the workshop, calmly drinking mate, looking at the street with peaceful eyes. "Don Julian, tell me, you know that even though you never signed a blueprint, this city will remember you." The old man smiled, his eyes lost in the sky. "Then I'd better keep building slowly, because there's no more lasting trace than the one that's not rushed." And just at that moment, a small child ran by on an old bicycle, stopped in front of the workshop and shouted, "Mom! Mom! The man who cures sad cars works there." Don Julian laughed for the first time in a long, long time. One of those laughs that come from the chest, that cleanse the soul, and Adrian thought, that's also a form of immortality. The weeks passed unhurriedly. Taller San Miguel was no longer just a workplace. It had become a refuge of knowledge, a trench against oblivion, a living school without desks or exams. People kept coming, some with engines, others with questions, and many simply with the desire to be close, because where there is truth, silence also teaches. And Don Julian remained the same, with his worn tools, with his scratched wooden box, with his clean gaze, fixed on the detail no one else saw. One Friday, at the end of the day, Adrian found him in front of a disassembled engine, but he wasn't working. He was just looking at it. "Is something wrong?" he asked. "Nothing. I was just thinking that this was the first engine I adjusted when I came to this workshop more than 30 years ago." "And what do you think now?" "That it's time to teach someone else how to finish it." Adrian understood. He sat down beside him, took the tools, and began. Don Julian didn't say a word. He just watched and smiled. The next day, the workshop opened as usual. But something felt different, not in the air, but in the people. From early on, flowers arrived, handwritten letters, messages from other countries, elderly people with tears in their eyes, children with drawings of cars and hearts. It wasn't an anniversary of anything. It wasn't a special date. It was the day when, finally, everyone understood something. Don Julian had decided to leave without disappearing. That same afternoon, as he closed the workshop, Adrian saw that Don Julian was no longer there. On the tool table, he found a wooden box with a note written in pencil, for when someone wants to listen more than to fix. Inside the box, there were no modern tools, only his favorite screwdriver, his usual rag, a small notebook with handmade drawings, and a sealed envelope. Adrian opened it. It was an old photo. In it, Don Julian appeared as a young man, with his back to the camera, looking at a disassembled engine, exactly as he had been days before, and on the back, a single sentence. "The greatest repair is teaching another to build better than you." From that day on, Adrian kept the workshop open. He cleaned it. He renovated it, without erasing its essence. Every screw he tightened carried a story. If this story touched something in your heart, subscribe now and activate the bell. Because in our next video, you will meet the humble mechanic who was called urgently to fix a billionaire woman's private jet. What he discovered inside the plane changed his life forever. Don't miss it.